2:30 a.m. Morrison Steel's parking lot swallowed in darkness. Nathan Foster's flashlight slices through the cold Iowa air, his worn boots echoing against cracked asphalt. 8 years. Perfect record. 0 violations. Then the scream pierces the night. Sharp. Desperate. Human. Behind the loading dock, a wounded female Marine lies twisted beside a dented sedan, crimson spreading beneath her torn jeans. Her fingers claw at gravel, dragging herself toward the driver's door with mechanical precision, like a soldier refusing to stay down. "Don't call anyone," she gasps when Nate drops beside her, but blood doesn't negotiate. He abandons his post, steps outside his authorized zone, dials 911 while she curses through gritted teeth. 47 minutes that Morrison's cameras capture in perfect detail. 47 minutes that will cost him everything. What Nate doesn't know is that saving this wounded stranger will strip away everything he's fought for and give him something he never expected. The morning sun cuts through Morrison's office blinds like a blade. Nate sits across from his supervisor's desk, still wearing yesterday's uniform, coffee stains mapping his exhaustion. The security footage plays on repeat, grainy black and white evidence of his 47-minute absence. Morrison doesn't look up from the paperwork. 8 years, Foster. I'll give you that. But rules are rules. His pen scratches against the termination letter with mechanical indifference. You abandoned your post during active duty, left company property unsecured, violated your sworn oath as a security officer. Nate's fingers find the small security badge clipped to his chest, the same badge he's worn proudly every night for 8 years. Sir, there was a woman bleeding out in your parking lot. She could have died. Morrison finally raises his eyes, cold as the Iowa winter outside. That's what 911 is for, Foster, from your authorized position, not from wherever you felt like wandering. The badge feels heavier now, like a weight around his neck, rather than a symbol of purpose. The woman's face flickers through his memory, pain etched in every line, but something else too. Recognition, as if she'd been waiting for someone exactly like him. I did what anyone with a conscience would do. Morrison slides the termination papers across the desk. Anyone with a conscience doesn't have 8 years of perfect security ratings to throw away for a stranger. 7-year-old Sophie bounces on her toes at Cedar Falls Elementary's pickup line, her gap-toothed grin visible even from the parking lot. Nate forces a smile as she climbs into their 10-year-old Honda, chattering about her art project and the new girl who shared her crayons. Daddy, you look tired. Did you catch any bad guys last night? The question hits like a physical blow. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that sometimes good guys get punished for doing good things? No bad guys last night, sweetheart. Just helped someone who needed help. Sophie nods seriously, her small hand patting his arm with the wisdom only children possess. That's what Mommy used to say. Help people even when it's hard. Anna's words, spoken through their daughter's voice, cut deeper than Morrison's dismissal. 3 years since cancer took his wife, and Sophie still carries her mother's lessons like precious stones. The Honda's engine coughs to life, a sound that usually comforts him, but now feels ominous. Their apartment building squats against the Cedar Falls skyline like a tired giant, all brown brick and cracked sidewalks. Nate carries Sophie's backpack up 3 flights of stairs while she skips ahead, her energy inexhaustible, despite the day's weight pressing down on his shoulders. Inside their small 2-bedroom home, everything reflects careful management of limited resources. Furniture purchased second-hand but maintained with pride. Sophie's artwork covering every available wall space. The kind of modest life built from love and determination rather than abundance. Can we have mac and cheese for dinner? The kind with the little shells? Sophie's requests are always simple, always achievable, as if she instinctively understands their financial boundaries without being told. Nate ruffles her hair and promises pasta shells while calculating whether they have enough groceries to last until his final paycheck arrives. The math doesn't work, but he'll make it work. He always does. The framed photo on the kitchen counter shows Anna laughing at some forgotten joke, her arms wrapped around a younger Sophie. The Cedar Falls diner smells like burnt coffee and broken dreams at 3 in the afternoon. Nate sits in a corner booth, laptop borrowed from the library, scrolling through job listings that might as well be written in foreign languages. Security positions want references from current employers. Warehouse jobs require lifting abilities his 35-year-old back isn't sure it can handle anymore. The waitress refills his coffee cup for the 4th time, her sympathetic smile worth more than the dollar tip he can barely afford. "Excuse me." The voice stops his heart cold. He knows it instantly, rough with pain, but unmistakably the same woman from the parking lot. She stands beside his booth, leaning heavily on a walking cane, her short auburn hair catching the afternoon light, streaming through the diner's windows. Up close, she looks different, cleaner, the dirt and blood gone, replaced by simple jeans and a plain sweater. But her eyes hold the same intensity that burned through her pain that night. "I wanted to thank you and apologize." She slides into the booth across from him without invitation, her movements careful but determined. There's something military in the way she holds herself, spine straight despite obvious discomfort, eyes constantly scanning the room's exits. "You don't need to apologize for bleeding." Nate closes the laptop, studying her face. The same sharp cheekbones, the same stubborn jaw that refused to show weakness even while losing blood on cold asphalt. But now he can see details that darkness had hidden. Freckles across her nose, a small scar at her left temple. "But you might want to thank someone else. I'm unemployed because of that night." Her face flickers with something between guilt and anger. "They fired you? For helping me?" The way she says it, with genuine shock, tells him she understands the injustice better than most. "That's not right. That's not how it's supposed to work." Her hands clench into fists on the table, as if she's fighting the urge to march straight to Morrison Steel and correct this oversight personally. Her name is Elena Brooks, 29 years old, former Marine sergeant with 2 tours in Afghanistan under her belt, and a medical discharge that came with more questions than answers. She tells him this while picking at a piece of pie she doesn't eat, her voice carrying the weight of someone who's learned that honesty often comes too late to matter. "I've been back stateside for 8 months, still figuring out how civilian life works." Her laugh holds no humor. Apparently, it doesn't include accepting help from strangers. The conversation flows easier than it should between 2 people who met in blood and desperation. Elena asks about Sophie, about the small details that make up Nate's carefully constructed single-parent life. He finds himself talking about Anna, not the sanitized version he usually shares, but the real memories. How she used to dance in the kitchen while making breakfast. How she taught Sophie to ride a bike in the parking lot behind their apartment building. How she made him promise, in those final hospital days, to never stop helping people in need. She sounds like she understood what service really means. Elena's fingers trace the condensation on her water glass. Some people wear uniforms, others just live the values. There's something in her tone that suggests she's talking about more than just Anna and Nate. Something that makes him wonder what kind of service brought her back to Iowa, and why a former Marine sergeant spends her nights driving through industrial parking lots. The afternoon light shifts, casting shadows across her face that make her look older, more tired. Elena insists on paying for his coffee before leaving, pressing a $20 bill into his hand despite his protests. "It's not charity. It's payment for saving my life." She limps toward the door, then pauses. Your daughter is lucky to have a father who still believes in doing the right thing. That's rarer than you might think. The bell above the diner door chimes her departure, leaving Nate alone with questions that multiply faster than answers. 3 days later, Elena appears at Nate's apartment building carrying 2 bags of groceries and wearing an expression that dares him to argue. Consider it payment for the hospital bill you covered. She'd tracked down the billing department, discovered his credit card on file, and come prepared to settle a debt he'd forgotten he owed. Sophie greets her like an old friend, chattering about school and showing off the purple cast on her wrist from a playground mishap. Elena examines the cast with professional interest, asking questions that suggest familiarity with orthopedic injuries. "Can Elena stay for dinner, Daddy? Please?" Sophie's eyes hold that particular brand of 7-year-old determination that's impossible to refuse. Elena looks between father and daughter, something vulnerable flickering across her features. "I don't want to impose." But she's already rolling up her sleeves, moving around their small kitchen with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making do with limited resources. She cooks like a soldier, simple ingredients transformed into something surprisingly comforting. The aroma of garlic and herbs fills their apartment, making it feel larger somehow. The evening unfolds in ways Nate didn't expect. Elena helps Sophie with homework, explaining fractions using pieces of apple that somehow make perfect sense. She fixes their leaky faucet with a multi-tool that appears from nowhere, working with hands that clearly understand machinery. When Sophie falls asleep on the couch between them during a movie, Elena doesn't mention leaving. Instead, she covers the girl with a blanket and speaks in hushed tones about the strangeness of civilian bedtimes and the luxury of feeling safe enough to sleep. "You're good with her." Nate watches Elena's face as she adjusts Sophie's blanket. Natural. Elena's smile carries shadows of things lost and things never had. "I always wondered what it would be like, having a family to come home to." The words hang in the air between them, heavy with implications neither is ready to explore. But something shifts in that moment, a recognition that loneliness takes many forms, and sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. Over the following weeks, Elena becomes a quiet fixture in their lives. She appears when Nate's car won't start, armed with jumper cables and the kind of mechanical knowledge that saves him a tow truck bill he can't afford. She brings soup when Sophie catches a cold, the kind that actually makes sick children feel better. She sits in job interview waiting rooms, not because Nate asks her to, but because she understands that sometimes moral support means simply being present. Her presence becomes as natural as breathing, filling spaces in their routine that Nate hadn't realized were empty. But there are odd things about Elena Brooks that Nate can't quite piece together. The way she tenses when helicopters fly overhead, her whole body going rigid until the sound fades. How she always sits with her back to the wall, facing the exits, even in the most casual settings. The expensive-looking equipment she carries in her beaten-up Toyota, laptop computers and communication devices that seem far beyond what a struggling veteran should afford. When he asks about her work, her answers stay carefully vague. Consulting, security stuff, boring technical things. Her reflexes are too sharp for civilian life. She catches Sophie's falling juice cup before it hits the floor, moves like liquid when someone drops a pot in the kitchen, scans every room like she's mapping potential threats. These aren't the habits of someone who's been out of the military for 8 months. They're the instincts of someone still very much in the game. But Nate doesn't push for explanations. Elena's secrets feel earned, carved from experiences he can't imagine and doesn't need to understand. The breakthrough comes during Sophie's school play. Elena sits beside Nate in the elementary school auditorium, watching their daughter stumble through her lines as tree number 3 in the environmental awareness production. When another parent's toddler has a choking emergency during intermission, Elena moves with professional precision. Her response is immediate, decisive, and exactly what someone with advanced medical training would do. But it's more than that. It's the way she communicates with the paramedics when they arrive, using terminology and protocols that go beyond basic first aid. "Where did you learn to do that?" Nate asks as they drive home, Sophie asleep in the back seat with her cardboard tree costume crumpled around her. Elena stares out the passenger window for a long moment. "The Marines teach you to handle emergencies. You pick things up." But her voice carries the weight of someone who's learned that truth often comes in carefully measured doses. There's more to Elena Brooks than medical training and mechanical skills. The question is whether Nate is ready to learn what that something might be. The signs multiply like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. Elena's phone rings at odd hours, conversations conducted in clipped, professional tones that suggest chains of command rather than casual social calls. She disappears for days at a time, offering vague explanations about consulting work that takes her to Des Moines or Omaha. Sophie accepts these absences with the adaptability of children, but Nate feels each departure like a small abandonment. When Elena returns, she's always slightly different, more tired, more careful, as if she's been somewhere that required constant vigilance. The answer comes on a Tuesday morning when Morrison Steel makes the local news. Federal agents swarm the facility, carrying boxes of evidence and leading Morrison himself away in handcuffs. The charges scroll across the bottom of the screen: embezzlement, insurance fraud, tax evasion, millions of dollars stolen from employee benefits, safety equipment never purchased, inspections falsified. The scope of the corruption makes Nate's stomach turn, not just for the betrayal, but for what it means about his own termination. Morrison fired him to silence a potential witness, not to maintain company discipline. Elena watches the news coverage with him, her expression unreadable. "Looks like you worked for the wrong kind of person." There's something in her tone that doesn't quite match her words, a satisfaction that seems too personal for someone who should be a neutral observer. When Nate mentions this, Elena deflects with questions about his job search and suggestions for celebrating Morrison's downfall. But the feeling lingers that Elena Brooks knows more about Morrison Steel's investigation than she's willing to admit. The truth emerges piece by piece over the following days. First, the FBI agent who calls to interview Nate about his time at Morrison Steel. Agent Sarah Chen explains that they've been investigating the company for months, building a case against Morrison's systematic theft from his own employees. "Your termination actually helped us establish pattern of behavior. Morrison consistently punished employees who might witness his activities." The conversation takes place in Nate's living room, Sophie at school, Elena conspicuously absent for the first time in weeks. Then comes the revelation that stops Nate cold. "We had an undercover operative in the area, gathering intelligence on Morrison's after-hours activities. Your rescue of our agent probably saved her life." Agent Chen's words echo in Nate's memory as he drives home from the interview. An undercover operative. A Marine who happened to be in Morrison's parking lot at 2:30 in the morning. Who knew exactly how to deflect medical questions and avoid official paperwork. Who possessed the kind of equipment and training that suggested active duty rather than veteran status. The confrontation happens that evening on Nate's apartment steps. Elena arrives as usual, carrying takeout dinner and asking about Sophie's day. But this time, Nate is waiting with questions that demand honest answers. "Agent Chen says I rescued an FBI undercover operative. She says this operative was a former Marine who'd been watching Morrison Steel for months." Elena's face doesn't change, but something dies behind her eyes. The careful mask of Elena Brooks, struggling veteran, begins to crack at the edges. "You want to know if I was using you?" Elena sets the takeout bags on the steps and sits down heavily. "If everything between us was part of some investigation." Her voice carries exhaustion that goes beyond physical pain. "The answer is complicated," she explains in careful, measured sentences. the FBI task force targeting defense contractor fraud, her assignment to monitor Morrison's activities, the night her surveillance went wrong when her car broke down in his parking lot and she injured herself trying to make repairs in the dark. My cover was blown the moment you called that ambulance. Real Elena Brooks would have refused help, avoided hospitals, stayed invisible. But you saved my life, and I had to figure out how to maintain the investigation while dealing with the civilian who'd become a witness. Elena's hands shake as she speaks, the composed facade finally cracking. But the rest of it, Sophie, dinners, job interviews, that wasn't part of any assignment. That was me trying to figure out how to be human again after 2 years of living lies. The betrayal cuts deeper than Morrison's termination. Not because Elena lied, but because the truth makes everything else questionable. Was her interest in Sophie genuine or professional assessment? Did she fix their faucet out of kindness or to maintain her cover? How much of Elena Brooks is real, and how much is FBI Special Agent Elena Martinez, task force operative with security clearance and a job that requires professional deception? I fell in love with both of you, with the life you've built, with the man who'd risk everything for a stranger. I need you to leave. The words tear from Nate's throat like broken glass. Sophie's been through enough loss. I won't let her get attached to someone else who's going to disappear. Elena nods as if she'd been expecting this response. I understand, I do. She stands slowly, her injury making the movement awkward. But I want you to know, everything I felt for you and Sophie was real. The job brought me here, but staying was my choice. Her voice breaks on the last word, revealing the woman beneath the agent. She walks away without looking back, leaving the takeout dinners cooling on his apartment steps. Through the window, Nate watches her Toyota disappear into Cedar Falls traffic, carrying with it the first genuine happiness he'd felt since Anna's death. Sophie appears at his elbow, pressing her face against the glass. Why is Elena leaving? Did we do something wrong? The questions pierce his heart because he doesn't have answers that make sense to a 7-year-old. How do you explain that sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the weight of secrets? The weeks that follow settle into a rhythm of careful normalcy. Nate finds work as a security guard at Cedar Falls Community Hospital. Better hours, decent pay, the kind of job that lets him pick Sophie up from school and help with homework. Sophie asks about Elena for the first few days, then seems to accept another adult's departure as one of life's inexplicable disappointments. But she draws pictures of 3 people instead of 2, and sometimes sets an extra place at their small dinner table. The Elena-shaped hole in their routine feels larger than the space she actually occupied. Morrison Steel's investigation concludes with Morrison sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, and the company assets liquidated to pay restitution to defrauded employees. Nate receives a settlement check that covers 3 months of expenses. Not enough to change their lives, but sufficient to provide the breathing room that poverty rarely allows. He frames his termination letter from Morrison as a reminder that sometimes getting fired is the best thing that can happen to an honest man. The badge Morrison stripped away has been replaced by hospital credentials that feel more meaningful. But late at night, when Sophie is asleep and the apartment feels too quiet, Nate finds himself thinking about Elena Brooks, not FBI Agent Martinez, but the woman who made Sophie laugh at homework time and fixed their broken things without being asked. The woman who understood what it meant to serve something larger than yourself, even when that service came with impossible costs. He wonders if she's still in Iowa, still fighting fraud and corruption from behind carefully constructed identities. He wonders if she ever thinks about mac and cheese dinners and 7-year-old tree costumes. The crisis arrives on a snowy February evening when Sophie collapses during her bath. Nate finds his daughter unconscious on the bathroom floor, her lips blue and her breathing shallow. The ambulance ride to Cedar Falls Community Hospital passes in a blur of sirens and desperate prayers. Sophie's fever spikes to 104 degrees. Bacterial meningitis. The doctors explain. Aggressive treatment, but the next 24 hours will determine everything. The words hit like physical blows, each medical term a hammer against his chest. Nate sits beside Sophie's hospital bed, holding her small hand and watching machines monitor every breath. The ICU's visiting hours restrict him to family only, but he can't leave her alone in this sterile maze of beeping equipment and clinical efficiency. When exhaustion finally claims him around 3 a.m., he dreams of Anna's voice telling him that some battles require more than one soldier. The chair beside Sophie's bed becomes his entire world, measured in the space between heartbeats and the rhythm of ventilator cycles. He wakes to find Elena sitting in the chair beside him. Not Agent Martinez in professional attire, but Elena in jeans and a sweatshirt, her hair pulled back and her eyes red with exhaustion that matches his own. "The nurses called me. I'm listed as emergency contact in your hospital records." Her voice is quiet, careful not to disturb Sophie's rest. "I hope that's okay." She doesn't explain how she knew Sophie was sick, or why her name appears in records Nate doesn't remember updating. She simply exists in this moment, present and solid, and exactly what he needs without knowing he needed it. The next 3 days blur together in a rhythm of medical updates and quiet vigil. Elena handles the practical details, coordinating with Nate's supervisor at the hospital, managing insurance paperwork, ensuring that someone is always with Sophie when the nurses need to run tests. She doesn't push for conversations about their relationship or explanations about her continued presence. She simply stays, the way soldiers stay with wounded comrades until help arrives. Her competence in this crisis feels like a gift, the kind of support that doesn't require acknowledgement or repayment. On the 4th day, Sophie opens her eyes and asks for pancakes. The fever breaks, the swelling subsides, and the doctors speak cautiously about full recovery with proper follow-up care. Nate cries for the first time since Anna's funeral, not from grief this time, but from relief so profound it feels like drowning in reverse. Elena holds him while he shakes with the fear he couldn't allow himself to feel, while Sophie needed him strong. Her arms feel like shelter, like the safe harbor he'd forgotten existed. "Thank you." The words are inadequate for what Elena's presence has meant, but they're the only ones he can manage. For being here. For staying. Elena brushes tears from his cheek with the kind of gentleness that comes from understanding what it means to almost lose everything. "I told you once that everything I felt for you and Sophie was real. That hasn't changed." Her voice carries certainty that cuts through months of doubt and confusion. The truth comes in the hospital parking lot while Sophie sleeps safely upstairs. Elena explains that her FBI assignment ended 3 months ago, but she never left Cedar Falls. "I took a job with a private security firm, corporate consulting, like I said. But I stayed because this is where you are, where Sophie is, where I found something I didn't know I was looking for." Her breath creates small clouds in the cold air, visible proof of words that feel too important for the winter darkness. She tells him about the apartment she rented 6 blocks from his building, about the job that lets her work remotely most days and travel only when absolutely necessary, about the choice she made to build a life in a small Iowa town, because 2 people there had become more important than career advancement or geographical preferences. "I understand if you can't trust me again, but I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere unless you ask me to." The vulnerability in her voice strips away the last pretense of professional distance. The snow falls softly outside Cedar Falls Community Hospital as Nate considers Elena's words. Sophie is safe upstairs, recovering with the resilience that children possess in abundance. His job provides stability and purpose. The small life he's built as a single father has room for expansion. if he can find the courage to risk his heart again. Sophie missed you. She kept drawing pictures with 3 people. Elena's smile transforms her entire face, erasing the careful professional mask she's worn since the night they met. I missed her too. Both of you. She reaches into her jacket pocket and pulls out a small wrapped package. I was saving this for when the time felt right, but I think maybe the time is now. Inside the wrapping is a keychain, a small metal badge with "World's Best Dad" engraved in childlike letters. Sophie made this. Nate turns the badge over in his hands, feeling the weight of love hammered into metal by small fingers. Last month, before she got sick, she wanted to replace your security badge with something better, something that recognized the job you're really good at. Elena's voice catches slightly. She asked me to help her with the engraving. Said her dad deserved a badge that couldn't be taken away by mean bosses. The keychain feels warm in his palm, solid proof that love persists even through separation and secrets, that some bonds survive the weight of complicated truths. 6 months later, the swing set stands completed in Nate's backyard, a project that required Elena's engineering skills, Sophie's creative input, and Nate's willingness to admit that some jobs require more than one person. Sophie tests each swing thoroughly, declaring the middle one perfect for 3 people if they sit close together. The late afternoon sun casts long shadows across their small yard, creating the kind of domestic scene Nate never imagined possible after Anna's death. The swing set represents something larger than playground equipment. It's evidence of commitment, of planning for a shared future. Elena, when are you going to have a swing at your house? Sophie's question carries the innocent directness that only 7-year-olds possess. Elena looks at Nate over Sophie's head, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes bright with possibility. Well, I suppose I might not need a swing at my house if there's room for me on this one. Sophie considers this with the seriousness of someone negotiating international treaties. There's definitely room, but you'd have to come to dinner every night and help with math homework and fix things when they break. Nate watches this exchange with the particular joy that comes from seeing your child negotiate the terms of her own happiness. Those sound like pretty demanding conditions, Elena. You sure you're up for that kind of commitment? Elena's laugh is rich with possibilities. Neither of them is quite ready to name, but both are willing to explore. I think I can handle those requirements, but I might need some time to make it official. The conversation dances around definitions and timelines, but the underlying current is clear. They're building toward something permanent. The evening settles around them, with the comfortable weight of routine establishing itself. Sophie swings between the 2 adults, chattering about school and friends, and whether they can get a dog now that they have a proper backyard. Elena mentions a consulting contract that will keep her in Cedar Falls for at least another year. Nate talks about the promotion opportunity at the hospital. Assistant security chief, better pay, the kind of stability that allows for planning beyond next month's rent. The conversation flows with the ease of people who've learned to trust each other's presence. They are not quite a family yet, but they are something worth building toward, something worth the risk of hoping again. As the sun sets over Cedar Falls, Iowa, 3 people sit on swings and talk about next week's plans with the quiet confidence of people who have learned that sometimes the best things come from unexpected places, and that love, real love, doesn't require perfect timing or ideal circumstances. It simply requires the courage to say yes when life offers second chances. The last light fades from the sky, painting their small yard in shades of purple and gold. Sophie's voice carries across the evening air, asking about tomorrow's adventure, next weekend's possibilities, the endless cascade of questions that define childhood. Elena and Nate answer in turns, their voices creating a harmony of shared responsibility and mutual affection. The swing set creaks gently in the breeze, solid and permanent, built to last through seasons of change and growth. In the distance, Cedar Falls settles into evening routines, families gathering for dinner, children called in from backyards, the quiet satisfaction of another day completed. But in one small yard, on 3 simple swings, the future unfolds one conversation at a time, one shared moment building toward the next, one family discovering that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the simple decision to help a stranger in the dark. But mostly, Dan thought as he watched Grace help Lily set the table, while Ben told Kate about his winning goal, sometimes the best things in life come disguised as broken-down cars on rainy nights, waiting for someone brave enough to pull over and lend a hand. The rain had stopped, the sun was shining, and somewhere in a small town in Pennsylvania, 2 families had become one family, proving that sometimes the most unlikely stories have the most beautiful endings. That night, Helena made a decision that would either save or destroy her custody case, depending on factors largely beyond her control. She called Benjamin, knowing that any continued contact between them would be scrutinized and potentially weaponized against her, but unable to watch her children disappear back into silent suffering when she knew that help existed and was being denied to them for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual well-being. "I need you to help them one more time," Helena said, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who'd finally run out of acceptable options. "I know what it might cost me legally, but I can't watch Ruby and Jasper lose themselves again just because the adults in their lives are more concerned with liability than healing." She paused, and Benjamin could hear years of self-doubt and societal pressure compressed into the silence. They were becoming themselves when they worked with you, real versions of themselves, not the medicated and managed versions that everyone else seems to prefer. The conversation that began as a desperate request for temporary intervention evolved into something much more significant, a mutual recognition that both Benjamin and Helena had been hiding from their authentic selves out of fear of judgment and loss. Helena's identity as a gallery heiress had overshadowed her genuine passion for supporting marginalized artistic voices, while Benjamin's retreat into anonymity had prevented him from using his gifts in service of the healing work that Luna had believed was his true calling. "What if we stopped hiding?" Helena asked, the words carrying weight that extended far beyond their immediate crisis. "What if we built something together, not just for Ruby and Jasper, but for all the children who need people to understand that different minds create different kinds of beauty?" The question hung between them, like a bridge leading toward a future neither had dared to imagine, but which suddenly seemed not just possible, but necessary. The decision to move forward required both of them to accept risks that felt almost insurmountable. Benjamin would have to emerge from his protective anonymity, revealing not just his artistic success, but the personal losses that had driven him into hiding. Helena would have to publicly defend her parenting choices and Benjamin's role in her children's lives, knowing that family court judges often prioritized institutional credibility over actual outcomes when determining custody arrangements. But as they planned their next steps, both Benjamin and Helena found themselves energized in ways they hadn't experienced since before their respective losses and compromises. The prospect of creating something authentic and meaningful together, a space where neurodivergent children could explore their creative gifts without having to apologize for the ways their minds processed information differently, felt like a return to the idealistic motivations that had originally drawn them toward art and healing. The first step was Benjamin's decision to publicly reveal his identity as the artist behind the anonymous donations that had funded neurodiversity research for the past 3 years. The announcement, made through Dr. Cross's academic networks rather than traditional media channels, recontextualized everything that had happened at Harmony Heights Academy. Instead of a maintenance worker overstepping professional boundaries, Benjamin Mitchell was revealed as a recognized expert in art therapy techniques whose informal interventions with Ruby and Jasper represented exactly the kind of innovative approaches that conventional therapeutic models often overlooked. The revelation had immediate legal implications for Helena's custody case. Expert witnesses who'd been prepared to testify about the dangers of unsupervised contact between children and unqualified personnel found themselves in the awkward position of having to explain why they considered a nationally recognized art therapy practitioner to be inappropriate for working with children who demonstrated clear benefits from his techniques. The narrative shifted from negligent supervision to innovative intervention, particularly when Dr. Cross agreed to testify about the sophisticated understanding of neurodivergent processing styles that Benjamin's work with the twins had demonstrated. But the legal victory was almost secondary to the personal transformation that revealing his identity created for Benjamin. After 3 years of deliberate invisibility, stepping back into public recognition as an artist felt like emerging from underwater and remembering how to breathe. The conversations with journalists and researchers who wanted to understand his therapeutic techniques forced him to articulate insights about art and healing that he'd been developing intuitively since Luna's death, but had never been required to explain in professional language. More importantly, the public revelation of his success allowed Benjamin to finally integrate the different aspects of his identity: the grieving widower, the devoted father, the successful artist, and the innovative therapist, into something coherent and authentic. He was no longer hiding significant parts of himself from the people who mattered to him, no longer maintaining exhausting boundaries between his public and private selves. The custody hearing that had seemed like such a threat ultimately became an opportunity for Helena to demonstrate exactly the kind of innovative thinking and child-centered advocacy that family courts claim to prioritize in determining the best interests of children. With Benjamin's identity revealed and his expertise established, Ruby and Jasper's improved functioning under his guidance became evidence of Helena's commitment to finding effective interventions for her children's specific needs, rather than simply accepting conventional treatments that hadn't proven successful. Ruby and Jasper themselves provided the most compelling testimony, not through formal statements, but through the artwork they created during the evaluation process. Working with Benjamin in a supervised therapeutic setting, they produced collaborative pieces that demonstrated not just artistic talent, but sophisticated emotional intelligence and self-awareness. Their ability to externalize complex internal experiences through visual metaphors showed the evaluating psychologists that their previous behavioral difficulties hadn't reflected developmental delays or emotional disturbance, but rather frustration at being unable to communicate their rich interior lives through conventional verbal channels. The court's decision to award Helena primary custody was based ultimately on evidence that her children were thriving under her care, particularly when that care included access to therapeutic interventions that matched their specific neurological and creative needs. But the victory felt less significant than the broader transformation that had occurred in all of their lives through the process of fighting for it. Benjamin's emergence from anonymity had attracted attention from other parents dealing with neurodivergent children, leading to consulting requests and collaboration opportunities that felt like natural extensions of the work he'd been doing intuitively for years. Helena's public advocacy for Ruby and Jasper had connected her with other families navigating similar challenges, creating the foundation for a community of support that extended far beyond their immediate legal victory. 6 months after the custody hearing concluded, Helena opened the doors of the Ashford Center for Neurodivergent Arts, a converted warehouse space that functioned simultaneously as an art therapy clinic, exhibition gallery, and resource center for families seeking alternatives to traditional special needs programming. Benjamin served as the center's director of therapeutic programming, developing curricula that integrated artistic expression with sensory regulation techniques and emotional processing skills. The center's first exhibition featured work by Ruby and Jasper, alongside pieces by other young artists whose neurodivergent perspectives had been marginalized or pathologized by conventional educational systems. The opening reception drew educators, therapists, and families from across the region, many of whom had never seen children's differences framed as sources of creative strength rather than obstacles to overcome. Ruby, now 7 and increasingly confident in her ability to describe her synesthetic experiences, gave impromptu tours of the exhibition to visitors who were curious about how color and sound intersected in her perceptual world. Her explanations were simultaneously scientifically sophisticated and poetically beautiful, demonstrating the kind of intellectual gifts that standardized assessments had consistently failed to identify or measure. Jasper had become fascinated with the architectural aspects of gallery design, creating detailed plans for exhibition spaces that accommodated different sensory processing needs while maintaining aesthetic coherence and visual impact. His designs were being studied by museum professionals who were beginning to understand that accessibility could enhance rather than compromise artistic environments. But perhaps the most significant transformation was visible in Benjamin himself, who had discovered that healing didn't require choosing between honoring Luna's memory and building a new life. His work at the center felt like a direct continuation of the therapeutic philosophy that Luna had embodied, while his relationship with Helena and her children had shown him that love didn't diminish through sharing, but rather multiplied in ways that created abundance rather than scarcity. Zoe had adapted to their expanded family configuration with the flexibility that children often demonstrate when adults model authentic emotional risk-taking. She'd developed a particularly close relationship with Ruby, whose artistic sensibilities complemented Zoe's more traditional academic strengths in ways that enriched both girls' creative development. Her relationship with Jasper was characterized by the patient mentorship of an older sibling who understood what it felt like to navigate the world with a mind that worked differently than expected. The center's success had attracted national attention from researchers and practitioners who were beginning to understand that neurodivergent children often possessed creative and intellectual gifts that conventional educational models weren't designed to recognize or cultivate. Benjamin found himself traveling to conferences and consulting with school districts that wanted to integrate art therapy techniques into their special education programming, spreading approaches that honored rather than pathologized neurological differences. But the work that felt most meaningful continued to happen in the quiet moments. The late afternoon sessions when a child who'd been labeled as behaviorally difficult discovered that their repetitive movements could be channeled into rhythmic artistic techniques, or the evening workshops where parents learned to see their children's intense interests as doorways to connection rather than obstacles to social development. Helena had found her own artistic voice through the process of advocating for Ruby and Jasper, creating mixed media pieces that explored themes of protection, transformation, and the beauty inherent in minds that processed reality through non-conventional pathways. Her work was featured in exhibitions alongside Benjamin's paintings and the children's collaborative projects, creating visual conversations that demonstrated how healing could become a creative act shared across generations and relationships. The anniversary of the center's opening was marked not with formal celebration, but with quiet recognition of how much had changed in all of their lives. Benjamin stood in the main gallery space, surrounded by artwork that represented hundreds of hours of therapeutic collaboration between neurodivergent children and adults who'd learned to see their differences as sources of creative potential rather than problems requiring correction. Ruby and Jasper were working on a new collaborative piece, a large-scale installation that incorporated Ruby's synesthetic color experiences with Jasper's mathematical pattern systems, creating a visual representation of how sibling relationships could honor individual differences while building shared meaning. Their easy collaboration spoke to the security they'd found in being understood and accepted for exactly who they were, rather than who others thought they should become. Helena approached Benjamin as he watched the children work, her presence both familiar and continuously surprising in the way that intimate relationships could contain both comfort and discovery. "Luna would be proud of what you've built here," she said quietly, and Benjamin felt the truth of that statement settle into his chest without the sharp pain that memories of his late wife had once carried. "She always said that healing happened in community," Benjamin replied, his voice carrying the particular warmth of someone who'd learned to integrate loss with new love rather than treating them as contradictory experiences. "I think she would have loved watching Ruby explain color to adults who've never considered that other people might see the world completely differently than they do." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their children, biological and chosen, create beauty from the raw materials of their unique perspectives and hard-won understanding. The quiet sounds of artistic creation filled the space around them, punctuated by soft conversations and occasional laughter as new discoveries emerged from the intersection of different minds working together toward shared goals. As evening light filtered through the gallery's windows, casting warm shadows across the children's workspace, Benjamin felt a deep sense of completion that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with authenticity. The journey from anonymous night janitor to recognized artist and therapeutic innovator had required him to risk everything he'd built from the ruins of his previous life, but it had led him to a version of himself that honored both his losses and his continuing capacity for love and creation. The children's voices drifted across the gallery space, discussing color temperatures and geometric relationships with the easy expertise of young artists who'd been taught to trust their perceptions and value their unique ways of processing information. In their confident collaboration, Benjamin could see the future that he and Helena were building together, a world where differences were celebrated rather than corrected, where healing happened through connection rather than isolation, and where love multiplied rather than diminished when shared across the complex networks of chosen family. The last visitors departed as darkness settled over the city, leaving the gallery space peaceful and warm in the glow of carefully positioned lighting that accommodated various sensory processing needs. Ruby had fallen asleep curled up next to her latest color study, while Jasper continued working on mathematical calculations for their next collaborative project. Zoe was reading quietly in a corner, occasionally looking up to observe the comfortable domesticity of their unconventional family gathering. Helena began the gentle process of transitioning the children toward home and bedtime routines, her movements carrying the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to create structure without rigidity, accommodation without chaos. Benjamin gathered art supplies and turned off equipment, his hands moving through familiar patterns that had become meditative rather than merely functional. As they prepared to leave the gallery space that had become the visible symbol of their commitment to honoring neurodivergent gifts, Benjamin paused to look once more at the children's collaborative installation. The piece seemed to pulse with its own internal light, geometric patterns and flowing colors, creating a visual representation of minds working together in harmony rather than competition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: funding applications and research collaborations, therapeutic sessions with children whose gifts hadn't yet been recognized, conversations with educators and parents who were beginning to understand that different didn't necessarily mean deficient. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet evidence of healing and creativity and love that had emerged from their willingness to risk authentic connection, Benjamin Mitchell felt the deep satisfaction of someone who'd finally learned to stop hiding from his own gifts and the people who needed them most. The drive home through the quiet city streets was filled with the comfortable silence of a family that had learned to communicate through presence as much as words, their different ways of processing and expressing emotion woven together into something resilient and beautiful and entirely their own. And in the peaceful breathing of children who finally felt safe enough to sleep deeply, Benjamin could hear the echo of Luna's voice, reminding him that the most important art was always the kind that helped other people remember they weren't alone in the world.